What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Risen 1, the first of the second trilogy from Piranha Bytes games that in a lot of ways really built off of their first title, Gothic 1, and the successes they had therein. But to get my usual stuff out of the way first, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it is not the only thing that I cover. Linked in the description below, you'll find a video explaining everything that I go over in these reviews, and if you're not subscribed and go to my channel page, the first thing you'll see is that video as well. Plus, my Steam profile is public and linked in the description below as well. But to kick the rest of this video off, I want to start by talking a little bit about the game's history, as it is rather old, originally releasing back in 2009. However, very recently, just a couple weeks ago from the time of this video, Risen 1 was finally ported to consoles and saw an update on the Steam release that brought things like full controller support along with Steam achievements, in addition to fixing a handful of prominent bugs. This particular update seems to be a part of an update to all of their older games that they've been doing to add things like Steam Workshop support to make them easier to play for people, especially their older titles like Gothic 1 and 2 that don't run on Steam, as Piranha Bytes in 2019 was bought out by THQ Nordic, which seems to be heading up a lot of these updates. But beyond just that, Risen 1 is somewhat of a return to form to the original two Gothic titles that they had worked on previously after the departure from that was Gothic 3, which is strangely enough where I want to start the story setup for this game. You see, Risen is connected to the Gothic universe in all but name. After the release of Gothic 3, Piranha Bytes had a fallout with their publisher at the time, a company called Joe Wood that has since went out of business. The results of this disagreement about how to proceed with their games, etc., resulted in Piranha Bytes losing the rights to the Gothic series for some time. This was simply a timed agreement and rights would revert back to Piranha Bytes after a set period of time, which is important to note simply because while Risen is technically a different series, it is also a follow-up to one of the potential endings to Gothic 3 that sees the gods driven from the world and humans being masters of their own fate, so to speak, which is really the story setup for Risen 1. In the aftermath of gods being driven from the world, other creatures have risen and have started fighting humans by scouring them from the earth, really, with storms that have rocked the land. However, members of the Inquisition are trying to put a stop to this, which is what we see in the game's opening scene, that sees us a stowaway on a ship while an Inquisitor fights one of these beings, that ultimately results in a shipwreck that sees us washed ashore of the Isle of Faranga, where naturally we are brought into the epicenter of events, while also just trying to survive. Now, while I'm not going to go full spoilers here, I am going to spoil some things absolutely, as there are parts of this story that I want to talk about and the game is quite old, so maybe skip ahead if you don't want to hear it, but the story consists of 4 chapters. The first couple are pretty good, and then it kind of starts to fall off towards the back half, and then the end of the game, the boss fight in particular, is almost comically bad. So chapters 1 and 2 are really, really good. So you actually have multiple routes through it. You basically decide which faction you want to join, and how you go about doing that will change the experience for you. There's several paths through chapter 1. Many of the quests can be completed in a variety of different ways, and then chapter 2, based on which faction you join, will also vary just a little bit, which can be fun to see. The story pretty much comes to a single path in chapter 3 and 4 though, where you're investigating the volcano at the center of the island, which seems to be resulting in the island itself being protected from the storms that are racking the rest of the world. Now, this ultimately culminates in a fight against a titan, which are the beings that have risen up in the absence of the gods. But the last chapter of the game sees you gathering the ancient armor and weapons of a Titan Lord, which is someone who fought the Titans. Now, the armor part of this quest is okay, but it requires you to get a shield and weapon that up to this point you probably haven't been playing the game using, as the game provides you multiple routes to combat and some people have been using magic and archery, but the last fight of the game forces you into something that is just not what you've been doing up to this point, as the last boss is more of a puzzle platformer platformer almost, where you have to stay on parts of a platform that are constantly dropping and disappearing so you don't fall into lava, while also shooting projectiles back at the boss to stun it, which allows you to run up and hit it with your Titan weapon. And you repeat this several times until the boss finally dies. It's a very much so platformer style boss, which is a bizarre addition to a game like this, and it was unexpected and didn't feel good at all. But beyond just that though, gathering a lot of the armor sends you to 5 little mini dungeons throughout the island where you have to gather the pieces, and I hated those dungeons so much. They are littered with instant kill traps, meaning that if you don't see them, you just immediately die. So there's a lot of reloading just from that kind of thing. And then they are littered with enemies that if they get a lucky critical hit on you, even with in-game gear, there's a serious chance they might just kill you, which between that and the instant kill traps got very annoying very quickly, which made the entire last part of the game feel very underwhelming. Which is funny because in my first impressions video, I was talking about how much I was enjoying the first part of the game, and that I'd be surprised if they dropped the ball towards the last half, but they honestly managed it. Through Chapter 3 I was okay, but the entirety of Chapter 4 was just not fun. But moving on from there a little bit, I want to talk about the factions themselves. There are really only 2 factions, but one of those factions has multiple ways it can be approached. The factions themselves are simply the Bandits and the Inquisition. The Inquisition has arrived on the island in response to what the Inquisitor is doing here, and has since taken over the one town of Harbor Town, kicking the Bandits and their leader Don Esteban out of town, imposing a bunch of new laws, and conscripting regular civilians into their order, forcing them to fight, and usually die. Which is interesting because both of these factions are certainly not people that you could really consider good, in my opinion. While the Inquisition is very much so law and order, they're definitely grinding people under their heel at the same time, which I did appreciate because it adds a sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't feeling to both factions. As you know, the Bandits are in fact bandits, so they have their own set of problems, but it's an interesting take. Now, the first chapter of the game sees you deciding which of these factions to join, and as a result of this, there are multiple quests you may or may not see at all. Multiple quests that can be resolved a variety of different ways. Many of them have direct opposition to each other where you side with the Bandits or the Inquisition on the matter. And when you get into Harbor Town, there's a ton of sort of non-combat quest solutions that see you doing all sorts of stuff. And this continues a tiny bit into Chapter 2 and then kind of falls off a bit into a more combat-focused experience against monsters and enemies, which puts you in a sort of weird position where in the early game, things like pickpocket and sneak are incredibly useful because you probably don't want to be fighting anything to begin with, as you are very weak at the beginning of the game, like in all Piranha Bytes games, and those avenues provide you a very easy way to complete quests. However, their usefulness, in particular pickpocket and sneak, becomes much less towards the later part of the game, which is something we'll talk a bit more about in progression. But the bandits, being thieves and bandits, can usually help you out with that kind of thing, which is why it can be a very effective way to go to side with them towards the beginning, but it feels like they fall off later. Especially because if you join the bandits, you don't get access to magic at all. At least not through traditional means of finding a trainer and utilizing them to teach you magic. What bandits get is access to the last couple of upgrades to swords and archery, meaning that if you want to go pure sword and board or become an archer, bandits are usually your best way to go. However, if you want to use magic of any kind, you probably want to go with the Inquisition, which is where things get a little further complicated because joining them can see you become either a warrior of the order or a mage. However, you might accidentally lock yourself out of becoming a mage because the Inquisition has made it illegal for people to be outside of Harbor Town due to everything going on, meaning that if you come across a warrior of the order camp, they will beat you up, knock you out, and force you to the Inquisition's monastery where they conscript you into being a warrior of the order. However, it is possible to voluntarily join the Inquisition by completing their quests inside Harbor Town once you make your way there, which can give you a recommendation, at which point when you go to the monastery, you have the option of becoming a mage. But interestingly enough, the forced sort of option, if it happens to you where you get knocked out and drugged to the monastery, which can absolutely feel a little railroady, in my opinion kind of wound up feeling like the best play style in terms of what you're capable of, because the Inquisition gets gets access to the best staff combat training, which is like two-handed spears and staves, but also they get access to crystal magic just by being a warrior of the order. Crystal magic are 3 basic magic attacks that anyone in the Inquisition gets to cast, and while the bandits can get access to these through a bit of a roundabout means, it's not something they get access to normally. So using the crystal magic in combination with melee attacks, say using the magic to soften up targets, thus not having to worry about ammunition, like say with the bow, and then switching to melee combat feels like a pretty good way to play. And it's the way I enjoyed the game the most. Though that said, you can do much the same thing with a bow and then switching to melee on the bandit side of things, so it's not so bad. Now, ironically, the one I think is actually the weakest is the mage. As the biggest difference between joining the mages and becoming a warrior of the order is that mages get access to runic magic, which means they can use other spells beyond crystal magic without having to have scrolls to do so. But the thing is, scrolls are cheap and plentiful, meaning that you don't really need runic magic to use those things, which makes the entire purpose of joining the mages kind of irrelevant because you can just get scrolls to do everything a mage can do. So while being a mage sounded really cool, I found it was the weakest option overall because the main thing it offers you can be rendered pretty useless simply by using scrolls. But from there, I want to talk a little bit about progression systems and everything that goes into what you can do once you join some of these factions, etc. Now, in many ways, the progression systems are just another iteration of Piranha Bytes games that they use in many of their games. As you level up, you're going to be gaining health and everything, but also earning training points. You then spend these training points at various trainers who can teach you up to a certain level about various things. This is broken down into attributes, various combat skills like sword and board, archery, magic, etc., crafting skills, and then more thievery-focused skills like, say, pickpocketing, sneak, etc. Now, like all of Piranha Bytes games, this is heavily prone to min-maxing, especially if you've played a little bit and you start to know where things are. To give an example of that, you can get a ring that gives you a point in sneak, which is the only point in sneak that you can get anyway. Thus, simply by having that ring and putting it on when you need to sneak, you've completely mitigated the entire purpose of ever learning how to sneak using your training points, which means that learning sneak the normal way through using those training points is a complete waste of time. But to break it down a little farther, in this particular game we have 3 attributes: strength, dexterity, and wisdom. Wisdom is only used for runic magic. You cannot find a trainer for this, but rather when you read at certain book stands or find consumables called stone plates, it will increase the attribute. In order to learn higher tiers of runic magic, you need wisdom. Beyond that, it doesn't serve much of a purpose. Strength and dexterity both provide extra damage to their associated weapons, while also meeting minimums to wield those weapons in the first place. Like previous titles, you can train these stats up to 100, but they can be pushed up to 200 via a variety of methods, such as potions and items that permanently increase those attributes that you can find on top of simply having items equipped that give you bonuses to these things as well. So pretty standard fare for Piranha Bytes. But from there we have the combat skills, which they've changed a tiny bit. We have a sort of point system where we earn like ranks as opposed to percentages like previously. And each point in a combat skill will usually give you a perk of some sort. In the case of crystal magic and archery, this just lets you use those ranged skills faster. There's less of a cooldown associated and they deal more damage. Whereas with the melee combat, this usually gives you access to things like parries or lets you wield, for instance, a bastard sword with one hand and lets you perform longer combos. And we'll talk a bit more about that in the combat section, but basically what you'd expect. Probably the most interesting stuff though to me was actually the crafting, as crafting has been present in Piranha Bytes up to this point, but this was probably the first game of theirs where I felt like engaging in the crafting was worthwhile outside of their most recent titles like Elix. Gothic 1, 2, and everything, they had crafting systems. There just wasn't a ton of reason to engage with them, whereas here it's done in a way that is easier to get into for starters, as resources are more abundant and you can gather most of what you need simply from the environment, which makes it feel like a more traditional crafting system. And also, the things you can craft are incredibly useful. Alchemy is how you're going to get access to your permanent attribute increasing potions, and smithing and prospecting to gather the ore and then use weapons is both a convenient way to gather money, but also was one of the best ways I found to give myself good weapons early on, as I wound up being able to make stuff that was much better than anything I could buy, which felt like using those training points there was a good use of my time. And smithing actually also gives you access to goldsmithing, which allows you to make jewelry and everything, which can also be very strong. And crafting a particular amulet that gives you bonuses to crystal magic is actually pretty much the only way to get crystal magic as a bandit, but even then it's still really weak, so you probably won't bother. But you can also craft some really strong jewelry to help you out this way as well. And that leaves us with thieving, which is like lockpicking, pickpocketing, and sneak. Now, as I've already mentioned, there's no reason to put points in sneak. You can get a ring that will give you a point in sneak, thus allowing you to do it, which will handle every instance in which you need it, which is few and far between. Lockpicking, pretty much everybody needs, as you're going to find lock cases and being able to get into them will help you out. So I'd recommend everybody grab that. But pickpocketing, while not necessarily required, is incredibly handy, as there are so many quests that are trivialized by being able to pickpocket someone. Oftentimes, especially in the early game, you'll be tasked with going and retrieving an item from someone, which is comically easy when you can just walk up to them and pickpocket it, which is done through conversation options. So it's incredibly useful in the early game, but then towards the end of the game it kind of falls off once you've got most of those quests completed and don't really need it anymore. But it does provide you a ton of options for creative quest solutions, so it can be a lot of fun. That though brings us to our combat section. Combat is interesting in Risen 1 because in many ways it's clunky, as is typical with Piranha Bytes games, but for the most part it's pretty good. They've made some significant changes here at this point in their history that I think helped overall, but nonetheless it's not exactly great. Now, the most interesting change to me was with the melee combat, because it took me a while to notice it, but as you level up your various combat skills with melee combat, you'll be able to perform longer combos and everything. But what took me a long time to notice was that while the game will allow you to perform a full combo, if you want to perform it quickly, you need to time your button presses correctly, because if you don't, you'll actually be swinging much slower than you would if you time out the mouse clicks or button presses with the end of your swing to transition to the next one. And if you do it properly, you'll actually be moving pretty quickly, which took me way too long to notice, because if you're bad at this, late game enemies will be incredibly effective at blocking you, which can make melee combat a bit of a nightmare. Beyond this though, we have two-handed weapons, one-handed weapons, you get access to shields. Shields are a little overpowered as they pretty much block all damage, provided something doesn't hit you in the back, etc. And you can use them to defensively wait for an opening if you're patient. Then we have our ranged attacks. Rather than simply pointing and highlighting an enemy and clicking to hit them, Risen 1 has you actually aiming your bow, so you'll be shooting actual projectiles that need to hit their target to deal any damage. And as you increase your archery skill, you'll be able to fire arrows more quickly and deal more damage. Pretty much what you'd expect from archery, but it feels okay here. About on par with the crystal magic, which is our primary combat-oriented magic. Once you have the required crystal to actually use it, you'll have three options: Fireball, Frost Lance, and Bullet. Fireball is an AoE. Frost Lance does probably the best, as it will occasionally freeze enemies. And then Bullet is quick, but deals less individual damage and costs a little less mana, making it probably the best option if you're trying to hit things very, very quickly and then transition to melee. So they've made some changes compared to their previous titles up to this point, which again make it feel a little better to play, as for the most part it's not as clunky as you might expect from other action RPGs from that era, but it's still pretty clunky. Though because some of these changes have been made, if you know what you're doing and you get a good feel for the combat system, it is possible to get to a point where you can overcome some of your stat deficiencies if you haven't quite gotten there yet, in terms of your training and learning points and everything, which is a nice little change. But that brings me to the gameplay and world system. Risen 1's Isle of Faranga is really fun to explore. It's also really rewarding to explore. They played a lot with verticality in this one. While the map is overall smaller, there's a lot of places you can climb and get up to. There's a volcano, which is a mountain that you can actually climb. There's a good bit of sort of underground dungeons, that kind of thing. But also, pretty much everywhere you turn, there's rewards to be found. There are secrets you can dig up if you have a shovel. If you have prospecting, you can mine resources and then use them to smith and craft things. There are plants all over the world, and if you know alchemy, you can turn those into useful things for yourself. There's also weapons, etc., and this is, of course, all kind of reined in a little bit by putting dangerous monsters in your path, as like all Piranha Bytes games, you are very weak in the beginning, which makes you quick work for even sort of medium tier monsters that litter paths you're not supposed to go to just yet at the early points in the game. But rising to that challenge, and again exploring, finding all these rewards, it's done in a way that feels really good. And you combine that with the sort of introduction to the game, which puts you on the path of one of these various factions, kind of drags you onto it in the case of the Warriors of the Order. They do a really good job of teaching you what the game is all about and how to approach it in a way that I think is really well done compared even to their later titles in the Elix series, which combined with the role-playing options between the bandits and the Inquisition, all the different quest outcomes, the sort of morally gray nature of each one, makes for a world that is just well put together, and it feels really good to explore those options in the first couple of chapters before the game sort of devolves story-wise in the later half. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that even today, with some of the updates we've seen, it is possible to complete various quests in a way that will, in some cases, potentially break the game. And while I personally never did anything that completely broke something, I did run into a few instances where I completed things in a way that left me with very unintuitive ways forward, where basically the game just didn't know what to tell me or how to direct me to the objective, and I wound up having to just look these things up to see how to complete quests in a variety of cases where the game just gave me zero information because of the order in which I approached things. And I would say that in particular is probably where the game shows its age the most, as there's just so many ways you can break various quests if you do them sort of out of order, which is probably the biggest thing to watch out for if you decide to play this game these days. And in my opinion, it's probably the biggest knock against the title overall. But that brings us to Steam Deck compatibility, and thankfully, due to the update that Risen was given just a couple weeks ago, it runs really well on the Steam Deck, as that update also brought the game to consoles, which means full controller support on Steam, as well as access to cloud saves, both of which are in general very good updates for the Steam Deck to get, because this means you can take your save games with you from PC to Steam Deck, on top of being able to use the sort of native controls on the Steam Deck without having to map them yourself or rely on a community layout. Now, on the sort of neutral side of this, a lot of the lines of dialogue are very small, so you might have some trouble reading them on the Steam Deck and need to use the magnifying tool, and the save games are required to be named, which is going to require you to use the virtual keyboard pretty regularly. But beyond that, it felt really good to play on the Steam Deck. The controller support works pretty well. Took me a second to kind of figure it out, but once I got the hang of it, it felt pretty smooth. So Risen 1, while technically only rated playable, is for the most part a pretty good experience, at least on that particular platform. But that leads us into positives and negatives. On the positive side of things, Risen 1 really focuses in on what Piranha Bytes is really good at, which is choosing between different factions, all of these quests that can have different outcomes, the sort of role-playing elements, that kind of thing, on top of their sort of RPG power curve that is associated almost entirely with them at this point, where you start off incredibly weak to getting quite overpowered towards the end of it, and Risen 1 is very much so a focus on those things. Combine that with the really compelling storylines and optional quests of Chapter 1 in particular, where you're choosing between the faction and all the outcomes that it can have, and I was having an incredible time for Chapters 1 and 2. Now, on the negative side of this, like pretty much every Piranha Bytes game, it is rather clunky. Now, Risen 1, a little less so than, say, Gothic, whereas you don't have to download a bunch of mods to play it or anything, you can just fire it up and play it. It is nonetheless a pretty clunky game, especially when you start looking at the sequence breaks that I mentioned earlier, where you can sort of mess up quests if you don't do them in the right order, which can lead to a frustrating experience. And then when I got to the end of the game, the last chapter in particular that leads to an underwhelming boss fight, I was mostly just frustrated by the end of the game as opposed to having a great time that I had been having up to that point. So basically the game really drops the ball towards like the last 25% right in there, and it gets to a point where I was going from having an incredible time to just having a bad one. But to draw all of that to a conclusion, like many of Piranha Bytes games, Risen 1 is certainly not for everybody, but if you can get past some of the clunkier RPG elements that are present in pretty much everything they do, there is potential here to have a really good time, even if that time does fall off by the end of Risen 1. Ultimately though, the game is incredibly cheap these days. I bought it on sale for literally like $1. I wouldn't be surprised if you can get it for free here and there even, as it is quite old. So with that sort of current price point, even full price, I think it's only like $10, there's a pretty good time there to be had, even if it does fall apart towards the back half. And of all the Piranha Bytes games I've played so far, I would say Risen is one of the better ones, though I think it will be interesting to rank all of them once I've gotten through all of their catalog. I plan on doing so, which I'm sure will be fun, but as it stands, Elix 1 still retains its top spot, and we'll see if that changes moving forward. But that has been my review for Risen 1. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. The channel is growing every day, which I couldn't do without you watching these videos, and it never ceases to amaze me that people want to listen to me ramble about this stuff. So truly, thank you. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.